In the society built by the early saints in the Salt Lake Valley, few women attained the status and fame accorded to Zina D.H. Young, a plural wife to Brigham Young and the third president of the Relief Society. Aunt Zina was recognized, known, and adored by virtually everyone. She was widely read, widely traveled, and widely respected. In the last century, there have been numerous articles and entire books written about her life and times. My purpose today is not to recount Zina's life or add to the many general biographies focusing on her. Instead, I'll focus on a much more limited period in her life, specifically the period almost wholly contained within the 1840s. It is this period, from the establishment of Nauvoo through the exodus to Salt Lake City, that introduces an amazing amount of change within the church and, not coincidentally, within the life of Zina. Zina arrived in Nauvoo with her parents in 1839 at the age of 18 after the saints were driven out of Missouri. The coming decade formed a crucible in which Zina's mettle was tested and her character forged. During the decade of 1841 to 1850, Zina would be married to 3 different men, participate in both polyandry and polygamy, establish several households, participate in the inner circles of Mormonism, be driven out of Nauvoo, travel across the continent, help establish a settlement in Iowa, attend the death of both her mother and her father, and give birth to 3 children by 2 different husbands. To say that this was a formative decade in the life of a remarkable woman seems an exercise in understatement. This decade of Zina's life is also one that is misunderstood by many. Based solely upon this period, it is not uncommon to hear of Zina as both heroine and victim, as pawn and prevaricator. She is viewed by some as weak, but by others as strong beyond measure. That this period of Zina's life can be placed under the microscope and her experiences be used for both good and ill speaks to the remarkable nature of the woman and her times. This time, this one decade of foment and change. Let me provide just one example of a criticism stated by a poster on the fair message boards. That marriage of Henry and Zina started their life and family together. Not long after, however, Joseph Smith wedged himself in as a third wheel. That bothers me. But at least Henry and Zina were still able to live and have children together. Then Brother Brigham comes along and one-ups Joseph by taking Henry's wife and sons as his property. And then, to add insult to injury, sends Henry on a faraway mission so he can't cause any problems when Brigham and Zina start to cohabit at winter quarters. Hopefully this better explains why I am so disturbed by Joseph's and Brigham's treatment of Zina and Henry. As shall be seen, nothing is ever as simple or as black and white as critics like to presume. In considering Zina and her relationships with the men in her life, let's start with her marriage to Henry Bailey Jacobs. Henry courted Zina in 1840 and early 1841. She was 19 going on 20, and Henry was 4 years her senior. Both were active church members and close to the leadership. Henry was an avid missionary, a friend of Zina's brothers, and a one-time member of the Nauvoo Legion Band. While Zina was being courted by Henry, she was also approached by Joseph Smith, who explained plural marriage to her and indicated that she should be his plural wife. From available accounts, Joseph approached Zina 3 times and was turned down each time. The teaching of plural marriage at this time was done in secret, one individual to another. There were only a few men and women who were introduced to and invited to participate in the principle. Zina clearly knew about the principle while being courted by Henry, but there is no extant information indicating that he was aware of plural marriage or of Joseph's proposals to Zina. Zina and Henry were married on March 7, 1841 by John C. Bennett, just a month after Bennett's election as mayor of Nauvoo. Bennett was also assistant president of the church. Tradition among some descendants of Henry and Zina indicates that Bennett was not their first choice to perform the marriage. Oa Cannon, granddaughter of Zina and Henry, relates the following. My mother, Emma R. Jacobs, told me that Zina asked the prophet to perform the marriage. They went to the clerk's office and the prophet did not arrive, so they were married by John C. Bennett. When they saw Joseph, they asked him why he didn't come, and he told them the Lord had made it known to him that she was to be his celestial wife. Inherent within the family tradition is the concept that Zina, and possibly Henry, knew prior to their marriage about plural marriage and that Joseph felt the Lord had commanded him to marry Zina. Sometime after Henry and Zina were married, Joseph told Zina Huntington, Zina's brother, the story of why he was compelled to introduce plural marriage and asked that Zina tell the story to Zina. As Zina is quoted by one author to have said, "Tell Zina, I have put it off and put it off until an angel with a drawn sword has stood before me and told me if I did not establish that principle, plurality of wives, and live it, I would lose my position in my life and the church could progress no further." Sometime after Zina heard this story, and almost 8 months after being married to Henry, Zina was sealed to Joseph Smith. The ordinance was performed by Dimmock on October 27, 1841, on the banks of the Mississippi River. This event marks a major change in Zina's behavior, as she had previously turned down Joseph's proposals. There was no divorce from Henry. Zina was still married to him prior to the sealing, was pregnant with Henry's first child at the time of the sealing, and continued to live as Henry's wife after the sealing. Joseph obviously felt that it was permissible to marry an already married woman, else he would not have been sealed to Zina. Some may claim that such polyandrous sealings were eternal in nature only, meaning that Joseph never intended them to be recognized as an earthly marriage. There is strong historical evidence to refute such a position, however. Perhaps the best contraindication in Zina's case is that the sealing was repeated after the completion of the Nauvoo Temple. Brigham was married to Zina in what appears to be a Levirate marriage on behalf of Joseph, and Zina declared herself a wife of the martyred prophet after polygamy was made public in the 1850s. There is some disagreement among authors and scholars as to whether Henry knew about Zina being sealed to Joseph. It seems obvious that Henry would have known sometime after the fact, but for many the more tantalizing question is whether he knew beforehand. Fawn Brodie concludes that Henry apparently knew nothing of this special ceremony, for when he toured southern Illinois with John D. Lee in the winter of 1842, he talked constantly of his wife's loveliness and fidelity. In other words, she takes Lee's late-life reflections of events a year after the sealing as conclusive evidence that Henry must not have known about the sealing. Brodie's conclusion is not based on first-hand reports. No such reports exist. Neither Zina or Joseph left records indicating whether Henry knew, and Henry was not a journal keeper as so many other saints were. Instead, Brodie bases her conclusions on inferences that she views as consistent with what, in her mind, must have been. In other words, Brodie cannot conceive of how Henry could possibly have known of and allowed the sealing, so she infers from the later statements of others that he must not have known. Such a priori assumptions are shaky, and later authors have come to the opposite conclusion, that Henry must have known given his intimacy with the prophet. Todd Compton states that his data suggests that the husbands of Joseph's polyandrous wives, including Zina, knew about the marriages and permitted them. Richard and Jenny Holtzapfel state that Henry stood as a witness to the sealing. I've discovered no evidence that Henry stood by as a witness at Zina's initial sealing to Joseph. I've also discovered no evidence that he didn't. There may well be no evidence either way. The fact is, we just don't know. Some authors have insisted that Henry was on a mission during October 1841, but this seems to be mere supposition. There is no historical record indicating that Henry was gone from Nauvoo at this time. Oa Cannon's research ultimately convinced her that Henry did know about the sealing, and she even mentions that Henry signed a paper relinquishing his right to Zina for eternity. The slip he signed is still in the records of the Salt Lake Temple. Such a record is not turned up, but Oa mentions it in more than one extant account that the slip existed. Assuming this family story is true, then it would seem that Henry knew within days of his marriage that Zina was to be sealed to Joseph. Why Zina chose to be sealed to Joseph Smith has been a vexing puzzle to many individuals. The whole matter can be initially confusing. Why would a group of women in Victorian America, including Zina, choose not to be sealed to their husbands, preferring instead to be sealed to Joseph Smith in a polyandrous relationship? There are multiple theories as to why Zina would enter a polyandrous marriage with Joseph. Perhaps it was an Abrahamic test, or Zina was showing obedience to priesthood authority. Some authors, and many critics, have suggested that manipulation and coercion were involved. I don't have time today to analyze each of these possible reasons, but suffice it to say that there is strong evidence that each is incorrect. I believe that a much stronger case can be made for the concept that Zina was not being obedient or subservient to mortal leaders, but to her God. This may seem a subtle difference, but it is a critical one. One can be